The man known to history as Andrew Jackson was born on the 15th of March, 1767. His birthplace is unclear, but it is likely that he was born at the house of his aunt and uncle, Jane and James Crawford, in modern-day Lancaster County, South Carolina. His father, also named Andrew Jackson, was an Irish Presbyterian whose Scottish ancestors arrived in Ulster, Ireland, in the 1690s. Many of these Scottish migrants to Ireland left their adopted homeland in Ireland after just a few decades, and in the 18th century settled in America as the Scots-Irish. Andrew Jackson was amongst them. In 1765, he left Carrickfergus near Belfast with his wife and 2 young boys, Hugh and Robert, for North America, and eventually settled in the Waxhaw region in the valley of the Catawba River in the Carolinas. In February 1767, while working on his 200-acre farm at 12 Mile Creek, Andrew Jackson Sr. died after a logging accident a few weeks before the birth of his 3rd son. Andrew Jackson's mother, Elizabeth Jackson, was born around 1740 in Carrickfergus. She married Andrew Jackson Sr. around 1761. After the death of her husband, Elizabeth and her sons moved into the house of her sister and brother-in-law, Jane and James Crawford, in the Carolinas, where she gave birth to her 3rd son, naming him Andrew after her recently deceased husband. Jackson grew up during a period of intensifying political tensions between the British government and the subjects of its colonies in North America, which would eventually lead to the outbreak of the American Revolution. At the end of the French and Indian Wars of 1754 to 1763, the British had gained control of Canada from France, but rather than rewarding the denizens of the 13 colonies along the east coast of what is now the United States for their loyalty in fighting for the crown during these wars, King George III's government in England instead imposed heavy taxes on the colonies through the Sugar Act of 1764 and the notorious Stamp Act of 1765. These measures provoked riots and boycotts from the colonists who believed that they should not be subject to taxation without parliamentary representation. These grievances re-emerged when the Tea Act of 1773 was introduced, a move which led to the infamous Boston Tea Party in the colony of Massachusetts in December 1773. British retaliatory measures against Boston and Massachusetts led the colonies to convene the First Continental Congress to coordinate a joint boycott of British goods in 1774. Armed hostilities commenced in April 1775 when British regulars exchanged fire with American militiamen at Lexington and Concord near Boston. And in June, the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia to establish the Continental Army and appointed George Washington of Virginia as its commander in the first stages of the American Revolutionary War. Subsequent events are well known. The colonies formed themselves into a United States of America and declared their independence from the British Crown in the summer of 1776. A long conflict would follow over the next 5 years, but in 1781 the colonials emerged victorious in the war, and 2 years later the British accepted peace terms which acknowledged the independence of the new United States. Andrew grew up against the backdrop of this conflict. During his childhood, he emerged as the brightest prospect out of the family's 3 children, and his mother, Elizabeth, made arrangements to train him as a church minister by sending him to a religious school. However, Elizabeth soon realized that Andrew's restless character made him unsuitable for a career in the church, and his schooling appears to have been cut short. Back home, she encouraged her sons to participate in militia drills, being an avid supporter of the colonial cause against the British. Her eldest son, Hugo, joined the militia but died during a military campaign in the summer of 1779. By 1781, the 14-year-old Andrew and his 17-year-old brother Robert were also marching with the local militia. In April 1781, the two brothers were captured at the Crawford House, and after Andrew refused to clean the shoes of a British officer, the officer struck him with his sword, wounding the young boy in the head and hand. The Jackson brothers and their cousin Thomas Crawford were taken to Camden, South Carolina, and after a couple of months' captivity, Elizabeth Jackson arrived to secure their release as part of a prisoner exchange. The boys had contracted smallpox in the prison camp, and while Andrew survived, Robert died soon after. Then, just weeks later, Andrew's mother contracted cholera and died too. Thus, at only 14 years of age, Andrew Jackson was orphaned as the only surviving member of his immediate family. In December 1782, the British evacuated Charleston, the largest port and city in the southern colonies, as part of their disengagement from the 13 colonies. This enabled Jackson to enter the city and claim a modest inheritance from his late paternal grandfather, which he promptly lost at the gambling table. He then returned home to the Waxhaw region, where he worked for a time as a teacher and managed the 200-acre farm he had inherited from his family. After a time, Jackson decided to become a lawyer. In early 1785, shortly before his 18th birthday, he was apprenticed to Spruce Mackay, a lawyer in Salisbury, North Carolina. After 2 years of studying the law by helping Mackay run his legal practice, Jackson went on to study under the wing of John Stokes, one of North Carolina's leading lawyers and a veteran of the Revolutionary War. After 6 months, Jackson was licensed as an attorney in North Carolina in September 1787. Hence, at just 20 years of age, he entered the legal trade, but he struggled to find clients, perhaps on account of his youth. In the summer of 1788, Jackson accompanied John McNary to the Western District of North Carolina. Back in April 1784, North Carolina had ceded its territory between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi to Congress to help pay off its war debts, and its inhabitants sought recognition as the independent state of Franklin. Part of the territory was also claimed by Spain, which controlled the province of Louisiana to the west of the Mississippi. By 1788, North Carolina rescinded its cession of its western counties and was trying to reassert its control over the region. McNary was a fellow apprentice under Mackay and had been appointed the new court's judge, while Jackson was named prosecutor. In October 1788, Jackson and McNary arrived in Nashville. Jackson lodged with Rachel Donaldson, the widow of John Donaldson, who led the expedition to settle the area 9 years earlier. Mrs. Donaldson's daughter, also called Rachel, was living there with her husband Louis Robards. Louis soon became jealous of Jackson and suspicious of his intentions. After refusing Jackson's challenge to a duel, Robards left his wife while Jackson moved out of the Donaldson house. It's unclear whether Jackson was romantically involved with Rachel at the time of the incident, but the two did subsequently marry in the Spanish-administered town of Natchez on the eastern bank of the Mississippi in the winter of 1789. Louis Robards did not initiate divorce proceedings until 1791, which was only granted in late 1793, so theoretically this first marriage between Andrew and Rachel was invalid. They exchanged vows again in January 1794, following the finalization of Rachel's divorce. By the time of the Jacksons' elopement in Natchez, the United States had adopted a new constitution. The product of an initiative to strengthen the federal government, the Constitution was created through a series of compromises between the delegates of a convention of the 13 states that met in Philadelphia in 1787. While smaller states wanted equal representation and large states wanted representation based on population, the framers decided on equal representation in the Senate and population-weighted representation in the House of Representatives. The Constitution split the country into Federalists, who supported the document, and Anti-Federalists, who believed it took too much power from individual states and gave that power to the central government. After the Constitution was ratified in the summer of 1788, the Federalists agreed to pass a Bill of Rights to appease their opponents. After North Carolina ratified the Constitution in November 1789, it agreed to cede its western counties to the federal government a second time, which formed part of the Southwest Territory created by Congress in 1790. This temporarily left Jackson without a job, but he reminded the new governor, William Blount, that the district still required an attorney and was confirmed in the role. In addition to his public office, he had private clients who were short on cash but could pay in land. This caused him to be involved in land speculation, forming a partnership with his friend and fellow lawyer John Overton. He also ran a trading enterprise, but quit the business after a counterparty defaulted and left him heavily indebted. In 1796, he and Rachel bought an estate called Hunter's Hill, where they lived for 8 years until selling out and moving next door to a property they called the Hermitage. Jackson owned many slaves here. While Jackson made very few oral and written statements about his views on slavery, it is generally agreed that his conduct and treatment of the slaves he owned was poor. There is, for instance, evidence of his ordering slaves to be whipped, and he separated slave families by selling off one slave and keeping the others. His conveyed views when he advocated good treatment of his slaves was always expressed as someone who was guarding his investment in what he considered to be his property, rather than someone who cared for the individuals involved on a human level. Over a dozen of Jackson's slaves would live at the White House when he became president, and they possibly were involved in building work there, which expanded the building and grounds. Jackson entered politics for the first time in 1796 after the district's population was found to have exceeded 60,000 people and was thus eligible for statehood. In January, he attended the Constitutional Convention at Knoxville, where he played an influential role in the establishment of the new state of Tennessee out of what had been the Western Territories of North Carolina. After Tennessee joined the Union on the 1st of June 1796, Jackson was elected in October as the state's lone congressman to the House of Representatives. He was a member of Thomas Jefferson's Democratic-Republican Party, which sought to limit the powers of the federal government and supported states' rights. In Congress, Jackson criticized President George Washington's administration for siding with the rival Federalist Party, which sought to expand the power of the central government. He also spoke in favor of a measure to compensate John Sevier, the governor of Tennessee, who led a reprisal attack on Cherokee settlements as commander of the Tennessee militia in 1793. In July 1797, Jackson's political mentor, William Blount, was expelled from the Senate after being deemed guilty of plotting to attack the Spanish in Louisiana and Florida in an attempt to open up navigation rights of the Mississippi to Americans. Blount returned to Tennessee, where he influenced Jackson's election as his replacement in the United States Senate, though Jackson resigned in April 1798 after just 6 months in the post, seemingly because he considered himself unsuited to the deliberative nature of legislative politics. Upon his return to Tennessee, Jackson accepted an offer from Governor Sevier to serve as a judge on the Tennessee Superior Court. While his personality may have been equally unsuited to be a judge, he dispensed justice in a way that was familiar to the Westerners. On one occasion, after a sheriff failed to arrest a local outlaw who threatened the court with a pistol and knife, Jackson took off his judicial robes and confronted the man himself with a pistol, forcing him to surrender. In February 1802, the command of the Tennessee State Militia fell vacant. This was the position that Jackson desired above all else, but in order to obtain it, he would face the incredibly popular John Sevier. Around 5 years earlier, the two men had narrowly avoided a duel after Jackson discovered that Sevier had undermined his attempts to secure command of the militia in 1796. As the militia officers cast their votes in 1802, Jackson and Sevier were tied, and the decision went to Governor Archibald Rowan, who happened to be Jackson's friend. Rowan duly voted in Jackson's favor, and on the 1st of April 1802, Major General Andrew Jackson was named commander of the Tennessee State Militia. The circumstances of Jackson's election reignited his feud with Sevier, who returned to the governor's office the following year. One day, the two men exchanged public insults in the state capital of Knoxville. This led to a duel, but when the two men met to fight, no shots were exchanged, and both rode off, cursing the other as a coward. In 1800, Thomas Jefferson was elected President of the United States, bringing to power a man who sympathized with the interests of rural frontier dwellers like Jackson. In 1803, Jefferson's administration managed to purchase the vast Louisiana territory from Napoleon Bonaparte's government in France for $15 million, a relatively small sum, considering that the lands involved stretched from Louisiana north to the Dakotas and covered all or part of 15 of America's modern-day states. Napoleon had decided to sell this vast territory as he abandoned efforts to preserve France's overseas empire and instead concentrated on dominating continental Europe. Among other things, the Louisiana Purchase meant that American ships could now freely navigate and trade along the Mississippi River, an issue that was particularly important to the Westerners. In 1805, after the end of his term as Jefferson's vice president, Aaron Burr journeyed to the western frontier and met Jackson at Nashville, Tennessee, where the two men discussed the prospect of war with Spain, the new western neighbor of the United States, following the Louisiana Purchase. In the early 19th century, the Spanish controlled Mexico, Texas, and other regions westwards to California, as well as Florida. In the summer of 1806, Burr informed Jackson that he was hoping to instigate a war with Spain and expand the U.S. border. As commander of the Tennessee militia, Jackson was initially happy to supply him with troops, but he soon received news that Burr's intentions were not to fight Spain, but to try and carve out his own empire out of the Louisiana Territory. As soon as he recognized Burr's treason, Jackson quickly disassociated himself from the former vice president. When the Burr conspiracy was uncovered, Jefferson responded by ordering his former vice president's arrest, and in June 1807 he was brought to trial at the district court in Richmond, Virginia. Jackson testified and gave evidence which implicated Burr. The former vice president, though, was soon exonerated on the basis that while he may have been conspiring to carve out his own country in the Louisiana Territory, he had never actually carried out his designs. The previous year, Jackson was involved in a duel with fatal consequences. A dispute over the authenticity of promissory notes paid to Jackson after a bet on a horse race led to a quarrel with Charles Dickinson, who may have additionally insulted Rachel Jackson in the process, a matter Jackson was not going to let rest. The two men faced each other across the border in Kentucky on the 30th of May, 1806. Dickinson fired first into Jackson's chest, breaking his ribs and narrowly missing his heart. After taking the time to steady himself and aim, Jackson pulled the trigger, only for his pistol to jam at half-cock. He pulled the pin back and fired again, dealing his opponent a mortal wound in the chest. The fact that Jackson killed Dickinson after a second pull of the trigger was a source of controversy and damaged his reputation for several years. In the meantime, Jackson's economic fortunes suffered a setback in 1808 as the country was plunged into an economic crisis. In 1806, Napoleon, who had crowned himself Emperor of the French, had been unable to defeat Britain on the seas and resorted to economic warfare by banning all British trade with the European continent. As the British Navy responded by blockading French ports, neutral American merchant ships sailing to France risked getting caught in the middle. For many years, the Royal Navy had resorted to boarding American ships to search for deserters, in some cases kidnapping American sailors outright, a practice known as impressment. President Jefferson threatened to go to war with Britain over the issue, but knew that the United States lacked the military capacity for such a confrontation. After Ambassador to Britain James Monroe failed to persuade the British to make a treaty commitment to stop impressment, Jefferson passed the Embargo Act in late 1807, banning American ships from foreign trade. The embargo impacted the whole country, with merchants in the Northeast unable to trade and southern farmers unable to export their produce. The decline in economic activity created major problems in Tennessee and other parts of the United States. In response, Jackson agitated for war with Britain. As the 1808 presidential election approached, Jackson refused to support Jefferson's hand-picked successor, James Madison, and instead backed the candidacy of James Monroe. Madison nevertheless won the Democratic-Republican nomination easily and was elected president in the autumn. Although Jefferson repealed the Embargo Act at the end of his second term, Madison continued to ban trade with Britain and France, doing little to alleviate the economic consequences for the country. In 1810, the young Henry Clay, who had served as defense attorney in the Burr trial, was elected to Congress representing Kentucky. The talented Clay was elected Speaker of the House immediately upon entering Congress in March 1811 and became one of the leading advocates for war with Britain. Clay found a willing ally in freshman Congressman John Calhoun of South Carolina, and the two were amongst the loudest of the war hawks, congressmen advocating for war with Britain. While Jackson prepared his militiamen for war, in 1812, President Madison issued a call for an army of 50,000 volunteers. In the early 1810s, the United States was facing war not only with the British, but the indigenous tribes to the west as well. For several years, the Shawnee chief Tecumseh was in the process of uniting the Native American tribes around the Great Lakes into a multi-tribe Native American confederacy, which prepared to take part in an armed confrontation with the United States. The prospect of a large body of native warriors bearing down on Tennessee was an alarming one for Jackson. More immediately, a band of Creek Indians attacked 6 American settlers, prompting Jackson to mount a campaign of retribution. Then, in November 1811, while Tecumseh was away recruiting allies, General William Henry Harrison of Indiana preemptively struck at the heart of his Confederacy by defeating a Native American force at Tippecanoe in November 1811. In response, Tecumseh allied with the British as what would become known as the War of 1812 broke out between the US and Britain in the summer of 1812 after years of escalating tensions. With the outbreak of war, 3,000 men volunteered for Jackson's Tennessee militia, and he was given orders by the War Department to go to New Orleans to defend against a potential attack. Owing to difficulties supplying his men, Jackson did not get going until early 1813. When they reached Natchez in mid-February, Jackson received an order from James Wilkinson to wait as the British threat had not yet materialized. Not long afterwards, he received an order from Secretary of War John Armstrong to disband his militia and surrender the arms to Wilkinson, which would have left them vulnerable to Native American attacks on the return journey to Nashville. Jackson therefore defied orders and marched his men back to Nashville, earning himself the nickname Old Hickory for his toughness and endurance. That summer, Jackson narrowly avoided death again when he was involved in another shootout after a dispute with his aide Thomas Hart Benton and his brother Jesse. While Jackson spent weeks recuperating from the wound in his left shoulder, a brutal civil war was being fought among the Creek Indians after a faction known as the Red Sticks, a group inspired by Tecumseh to wage war not only against the whites but against their fellow tribesmen who were more accommodative towards the white population, began attacking their fellow Creek tribesmen. In late August of 1813, the Red Sticks massacred hundreds of American settlers at Fort Mims in Alabama, prompting President Madison to call out the Tennessee militia in September. After bringing together 2,500 men at Fayetteville in October of 1813, Jackson set off in pursuit of the Red Sticks. On the 3rd of November, his cavalry, under General John Coffee, sacked the Creek town of Tallahatchie, after which Jackson sent an orphaned Native American boy to Rachel to raise as a son alongside his nephew Andrew Jackson Jr., whom they adopted in 1808. Less than a week later, he came to the aid of the friendly White Sticks at Talladega, where they encircled 700 Red Sticks and destroyed half their force. Jackson's success in the South was accompanied by news of Tecumseh's defeat and death at the Battle of the Thames on the 5th of October 1813. The death of the Native American leader caused his Confederacy to break up. On the 27th of March 1814, Jackson's army of 2,000 men attacked the Red Sticks in their fortified camp at Horseshoe Bend near the Tallapoosa River. While the Tennesseans launched a frontal assault, Jackson's cavalry and his Cherokee and White Stick allies attacked from the rear, capturing the camp and killing most of the 1,000 Red Stick warriors before building a fort of their own, which they named Fort Jackson. A few weeks later, Jackson received the surrender of William Weatherford, the mixed-race chief of the Red Sticks. In June 1814, Jackson was rewarded with promotion to Major General in the regular United States Army and command of the 7th Military District, encompassing Tennessee, the Mississippi Territory, and Louisiana. In August, he imposed the Treaty of Fort Jackson upon the Creek Nation, punishing both loyal White Sticks and hostile Red Sticks alike by forcing them to give up almost 100,000 square kilometers of territory. The Creek War may have been over, but the War of 1812 continued to rage with the British. The defeat and abdication of Emperor Napoleon in France in the spring of 1814 weakened America's diplomatic position and gave Britain the opportunity to focus its war efforts across the Atlantic. That summer, while American and British peace delegations began talks in Ghent in the Low Countries in Europe, Major General Robert Ross landed in Maryland, and on the 24th of August his column entered the American capital of Washington, D.C., and set fire to the city and its government buildings. Not long after this, Jackson marched to Pensacola, Florida, claiming that the Spanish had violated its neutrality after a British naval squadron stopped for repairs. On the 7th of November 1814, Jackson attacked the city, prompting the Spanish to surrender and the British ships to withdraw. A few weeks earlier, Jackson had received a message from New Orleans about the prospect of a British attack on the Louisiana port city. After securing Pensacola, Jackson hurried to New Orleans and arrived on the 1st of December. There, he imposed martial law and took command of the Louisiana militia. Having also formed an alliance with the pirate Jean Lafitte, Jackson had around 5,000 men at his disposal. The British army that sailed to meet him was twice as large, while its commander, General Edward Pakenham, was the famous Duke of Wellington's brother-in-law. On the 23rd of December, the British vanguard landed 6 miles to the south of the city, prompting Jackson to launch a night raid to push it back. Over the next 2 weeks, the two armies prepared for the main showdown, building field fortifications and deploying artillery. Pakenham launched his frontal assault at dawn on the 8th of January 1815. The American artillery cut down ranks of British redcoats as they advanced, and the British soldiers who reached the American ramparts were picked off by the defenders as they attempted to scale the earthen walls. General Pakenham rode forward to rally the 44th Infantry Regiment and was about to lead them into the attack when he was killed by a musket ball. The death of their commander prompted the British to withdraw from the field. From behind their ramparts, Jackson's militiamen lost 13 killed and fewer than 100 total casualties, while the British lost more than 2,000 killed and wounded. When news of Jackson's victory spread across the United States in early February of 1815, the country breathed a collective sigh of relief. The Union was saved, and in the eyes of many Americans, General Andrew Jackson was its savior. He was feted as the country's greatest military commander since George Washington. Around a week later, news arrived that the war had been ended by a treaty signed at Ghent in Europe on the 24th of December 1814. This was 2 weeks before the Battle of New Orleans, but in an age prior to telephones, radios, or any other form of telecommunications, it was weeks before news of the peace agreement reached North America. Britain agreed to restore the Canadian-American border as it had been before the war, while the end of the war with France in Europe had brought to an end many of the naval tensions which had caused the War of 1812 in the first place. At the end of 1815, Jackson was invited to Washington by President Madison, who wished not only to bask in the light of the military hero, but to determine what his political ambitions might be. In due course, Jackson agreed to support James Monroe as the Democratic-Republican candidate in the 1816 election and was named commander of federal troops in the southern half of the United States. In 1816, Jackson turned his attention back to Spanish Florida, which the Seminole tribe used as a base to attack American settlers across the border. While Jackson hoped to put pressure on Spain to deal with the Native American attack, Crawford ordered Jackson to stop Tennesseans from settling on Cherokee land in the northern Mississippi Territory. After Jackson informed Madison that it was impossible to comply with such an order, the president appointed him to a committee to consider the rights of the Cherokees and the Chickasaws to the disputed territory. Since the committee was dominated by whites, they forced the Native Americans to cede the land in exchange for a modest monetary sum. In his correspondence with James Monroe, widely expected to be the next president, Jackson argued that respecting Native American sovereignty would damage the interests and security of the United States, and the best policy towards the Native Americans was to assimilate them into American society. Monroe took office in March 1817. In January 1818, Jackson saw a copy of the War Department's orders to General Edmund Gaines to chase Seminole raiders into Florida, but without attacking Spanish troops or forts. Jackson believed that the order would merely encourage the Seminoles and other hostile peoples to take refuge in Florida, and in a letter to Monroe suggested seizing Florida by force instead, a task he estimated would take 60 days to accomplish. While Monroe later claimed that he did not see the letter, Jackson claimed that the president had given his assent to his plan. Thus, in early 1818, Jackson rallied his Tennessean volunteers and marched south. In March and April, his army captured several Seminole villages with little resistance, as well as the Spanish settlement of St. Mark's. Then, on his return journey north, he captured Pensacola once again and left it with a garrison of American troops, demonstrating the weakness of Spanish authorities in Florida. Jackson's actions not only infuriated the Spanish, but also the Monroe administration, and he was ordered to relinquish control of the Spanish forts. In 1819, the American Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, and the Spanish ambassador to the U.S., Luis de Onís, signed a treaty whereby Spain ceded Florida to the United States. Not long after the end of the conflict that became known as the First Seminole War, the country was once again hit by a devastating economic crisis known as the Panic of 1819, which resulted from an influx of cheap imports as European industries recovered following the end of the Napoleonic Wars. The crisis was exacerbated when the Bank of the United States stopped lending for land speculation in the West, causing land prices to fall 75%. Government debt continued to increase, and Congress mandated the Monroe administration to cut back its spending on the army. Accordingly, Jackson was cashiered, or retired, as a major general. Monroe did not want to make an enemy out of Jackson and offered him the governorship of Florida after Spain finally decided to ratify the Adams-Onís Treaty. On the 10th of July, Jackson accepted the transfer of authority from Spanish Governor José María Callava. After only a couple of months, Jackson left for home and wrote to Monroe resigning the governorship due to illness. During the early 1820s, Jackson's friends approached him for a run at the presidency in 1824, not so much for his own sake, but to challenge William Crawford, the preferred candidate of former presidents Jefferson and Madison, and therefore regarded as a creature of the Washington establishment. While Jackson indicated that Adams or Calhoun might be in a better position to defeat Crawford, in 1822 he signaled to friends in the Tennessee legislature that he would be prepared to run for president, and at a convention in Pennsylvania in February 1823, he was nominated to run. His rivals for the White House included Monroe's senior cabinet secretaries, Adams and Crawford, as well as Speaker of the House, Henry Clay. Although he did not campaign actively for the presidency, such was his record as a war hero that Jackson received 42% of the popular vote. Jackson won 99 electoral votes to Adams's 84, while Crawford's 41 votes edged out Clay, who only won 37. Since no candidate won a majority of electoral votes, it was up to the House of Representatives to choose among the top three finishers. As Speaker, Clay would preside over the election, and while out of the running himself, his support could tip the balance in either Jackson or Adams's favor. The Speaker was no admirer of Adams, but feared that Jackson might become a military dictator. In the winter of 1824, Clay met Adams and offered him his support. Hence, when the House cast its ballots on the 9th of February 1825, Adams won 13 states to Jackson's 7, and was duly elected. Within weeks of taking office, President Adams appointed Henry Clay as Secretary of State, an office widely regarded as the stepping stone to the presidency. Jackson's allies claimed that Adams and Clay had struck a corrupt bargain, through which Clay as Speaker had delivered Adams the White House, despite Jackson winning far more supporters in the election, and in return, Adams was paving the way for Clay to succeed him as president one day. Consequently, while Jackson returned to his farm in Tennessee after the election, the Jacksonian cause was promoted in Congress by his fellow Tennessean, Senator John Eaton, and Representative Sam Houston, as well as the U.S. Senator Martin Van Buren, who began to form a coalition that would become the basis for the new Democratic Party that would contest the 1828 U.S. presidential election in support of Jackson. In one of the most bitterly contested presidential elections in American history, Jackson's opponents dug into his past to fuel their attacks, including his passion for dueling, his record of disobeying the federal government, his treatment of Native Americans, and his heavy-handed military discipline. Jackson's supporters retaliated by presenting their candidate as the people's champion against the corrupt Washington elite. Ultimately, Adams' supporters failed to prevent Jackson winning the election by a margin of 178 electoral votes to 83. Despite his electoral triumph, Jackson could not help but feel a certain amount of anxiety on behalf of his wife Rachel, who hated the prospect of life in Washington and would find herself subjected to extreme scrutiny. Rachel's anxiety contributed to a heart attack on the 18th of December 1828, and she died 4 days later. Her heartbroken husband held her so tightly that her body had to be pried from his arms for burial, and the president-elect doubted whether he should go to Washington at all. While he could not escape the conclusion that Rachel's death was a direct consequence of his political ambitions, his sense of duty motivated him to travel to Washington for his inauguration as the 7th President of the United States on the 4th of March, 1829. Jackson gave a brief inaugural address, vowing to respect the constitutional limits of his executive power and the rights of the states. As he departed for the White House, the large crowd that had gathered for the opportunity to meet their hero broke the cable restraining them, and the new president had trouble making his way to his new home. Having invited the people into the White House for a reception, Jackson was forced to escape through a side window to his hotel to avoid being overwhelmed. The unedifying spectacle was as sure a sign as any that Andrew Jackson was the people's president. Jackson had fought the 1828 campaign attacking the Adams administration for corruption, and he considered it his duty to root out the federal officials whom he considered part of the anti-democratic Washington elite. For Secretary of State, he appointed Martin Van Buren. As Secretary of the Treasury, he appointed Samuel Ingham of Pennsylvania, and as Secretary of War, he chose his friend from Tennessee, John Eaton. The choice of a protégé for the War Department was an indication that Jackson sought to have personal control of military affairs. As a Washington outsider, Jackson also relied on advice from a small circle of allies, including William Lewis of Tennessee, journalists Amos Kendall of Kentucky, and Duff Green from Missouri, and Isaac Hill of New Hampshire, all of whom were induced to stay in Washington with minor government posts. The president's nephew, Andrew Donaldson, served as his secretary and was also part of the so-called Kitchen Cabinet. Jackson claimed that federal officials would perform more effectively if they were not guaranteed their jobs for life, as they effectively had been in the past, but his critics accused him of creating a spoils system to reward his supporters. The first major crisis of the Jackson presidency had nothing to do with policy, but rather gossiping among society in Washington, and especially the wives of Jackson's cabinet secretaries. On New Year's Day, 1829, the widowed John Eaton married the young Peg O'Neill, whose first husband, a naval officer named John Timberlake, had died by his own hand in 1828. Rumors spread that the newlyweds had been having an affair which drove Timberlake to such drastic action, and after Eaton was named Secretary of War, the wives of Jackson's cabinet secretaries organized a social boycott, led by Floride Calhoun, the wife of Jackson's vice president, John Calhoun. The attacks on Peg Eaton's honor reminded the president of the accusations against his own late wife, and Jackson stood firmly on the side of the Eatons in what became known as the Petticoat Affair. Secretary of State Martin Van Buren, a widower like Jackson, also rallied to Peg Eaton's defense, mobilizing the foreign ambassadors and their wives to call on the Eatons in solidarity. Van Buren's support earned him Jackson's confidence, especially as his nephew and secretary Andrew Donaldson had joined his wife Emily in boycotting the Eatons, an action which led the president to send them back home to Nashville. On the 8th of December, 1829, Jackson delivered his first annual address to Congress. After starting by discussing some of his plans in foreign policy, including uncharacteristically warm words for Britain, Jackson turned to his domestic agenda. He proposed abolishing the Electoral College so presidents would be elected by popular vote, an arrangement which would have made him president in 1824. Perhaps in response to his opponents' claims that he would be a new Caesar or Bonaparte, he also supported limiting presidents to a single term of up to 6 years. In the decade since the Panic of 1819, the country was split over whether to increase or reduce tariffs. The Northerners and Westerners broadly supported increasing the tariff to protect and nurture American industries, but the Southerners favored lowering the tariff to access cheaper imports. While Jackson sympathized with the South and the cause of free trade, he also saw tariffs as a way of raising revenue for the government to pay down its debt. He also addressed Native American affairs, referring to an ongoing controversy in which the Cherokees and Creeks claimed to be exempt from state laws in Georgia and Alabama, and appealed to the president for protection. Jackson refused their appeal and proposed granting land west of the Mississippi to those Native Americans who wished to retain tribal autonomy, but the ones who stayed would have to obey state laws. Ongoing tensions over tariff reform and the fallout from the Petticoat Affair contributed to an ever-widening rift between Jackson and Vice President Calhoun. The passage of the Tariff of 1828 during the Adams administration led to the publication of an anonymous report in December 1828 under the title South Carolina Exposition and Protest. The author argued that while the Constitution gave the federal government the power to levy a tariff to collect revenue, this did not mean it could do so in order to protect domestic industries. After claiming that the tariff had been imposed by an unchecked majority in the North against the interests of the South, he quoted the 10th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which stated that all powers not specifically delegated to the federal government are expressly reserved to the states and the people, and thus states could veto or nullify actions of the federal government they deemed unconstitutional. Despite his attempts to remain anonymous, the author of this bombshell report was none other than Vice President Calhoun. The debates that followed on tariff reform inspired one of the most memorable exchanges during Jackson's presidency. On the 13th of April 1830, Jackson and Calhoun were present at a celebration of the late Jefferson's birthday. The day before, Jackson read the list of toasters from the dinner's program and concluded that they were all nullifiers. After the 24 scheduled toasts praising nullification, Jackson responded defiantly, "Our federal union, it must be preserved." Calhoun was next to speak and responded, "The Union, next to our liberty, the most dear." The Vice President's failure to acknowledge the Union's supremacy further alienated him from Jackson. The disagreements between the two men split the cabinet, and in 1831, Jackson persuaded them all to step aside, including his allies. Eaton returned to the Senate, while Van Buren was dispatched to London as ambassador with a promise of the vice presidential candidacy in 1832. Throughout his life, President Jackson was suspicious towards banks and financial institutions, blaming them for the boom and bust cycles which caused unfortunate citizens to fall into debt and ruin. The Bank of the United States' handling of the economic crisis of 1819 seemed to confirm this view. The bank's charter was up for renewal in 1836, but in 1831, Henry Clay advised Bank President Nicholas Biddle to seek a renewal of the charter. Clay anticipated that Congress would approve the renewal and challenged Jackson to veto it. Clay had been nominated as the presidential candidate for the National Republican Party for the 1832 election and wanted to fight the election as a referendum on the future of the bank. Daniel Webster also persuaded Biddle to seek an early renewal, fearing that there wouldn't be enough votes in Congress if Jackson and his Democrats were to win easily. After Biddle submitted the application in early 1832, Webster underlined the necessity of the bank as the issuer of a national currency. Opponents of the bank, such as Thomas Benton, proposed doing away with banks and paper money altogether and recognizing gold and silver coinage as the only legal tender. After the charter's renewal passed both houses, Jackson issued his anticipated veto on constitutional grounds. Yet, despite protests at the despotism of King Andrew I, Jackson and Van Buren were elected president and vice president by a margin of 219 to 49 electoral votes. While the tariff and secession crisis was new, the disputes over Native American land were all too familiar. During Jackson's presidency, the issue of the Native Americans east of the River Mississippi became prominent. Although the Cherokees in Georgia had attempted to assimilate with their white neighbors by adopting a writing system for their language and joined them as farmers and traders, this did not prevent the Georgia legislature from passing punitive laws in an attempt to force them to move west. Jackson continued to believe that there was no practical means of stopping white settlers from encroaching on Native American lands, and the best way to prevent bloodshed was for the tribes to move west of the Mississippi, which in turn would open up land for white settlement. As a result, in 1830, he introduced the Indian Removal Act, which allowed the federal government to exchange Native American land east of the Mississippi for new lands to the west. In 1831, the Choctaws had agreed to do so, but poor weather and unfamiliar terrain caused thousands to perish in what was described by a Choctaw chief as a Trail of Tears, a name that has stuck ever since to describe the appalling relocation policies of the 1830s. Nevertheless, in a message to Congress in February 1832, Jackson called on other Native American tribes to follow the example of the Choctaws, adding that, quote, "the complete execution of the plan of removal of the Indians should be made without further delay." As Jackson approached the end of his second term, the unrenewed charter of the Bank of the United States was set to expire. Nicholas Biddle, the president of the Bank of the United States, still expected the bank to receive its charter at the last minute, since to do otherwise would risk an economic crisis. After advice from Attorney General Roger Taney back in June 1833, Jackson had decided to withdraw Treasury deposits from the National Bank and instead deposit them in smaller state banks. When Jackson's Treasury Secretary William Duane refused, Jackson dismissed him and appointed Taney as acting secretary, who carried out the transfer as planned on the 1st of October 1833. In response, Biddle tightened credit in order to strengthen the bank, but also to engineer a financial crisis as a demonstration of the bank's economic power. While regional banks collapsed all over the country, Biddle mobilized his political allies in Congress, and from the Senate, Henry Clay introduced a motion of censure against Jackson for withdrawing federal deposits without congressional approval. Jackson remained steadfast in defense of his policies, and by the spring of 1834, the liquidity started flowing from the state banks back into the economy. Having defeated Biddle in the bank wars, on the 1st of January 1835, Jackson announced that the federal government had paid off its debts. However, as Daniel Webster had predicted a few years earlier, the state banks were empowered to issue notes beyond the country's economic capacity, creating a speculative bubble. In July 1836, Jackson belatedly tried to dampen the speculation in land by forcing purchasers to buy land in gold or silver. Land values plummeted, causing a wider economic slump which would not be felt until 1837, when Jackson was out of office. For all his rhetoric about bankers fueling boom and bust cycles, Jackson had created one of his own with his bank policy. For a man who had made his name on the battlefield, Jackson's presidency was relatively peaceful. Instead, as President Jackson, he preferred to use diplomatic methods to achieve his foreign policy goals. He had always believed that Texas was included in the Louisiana Purchase, and in 1829 he sought to negotiate a purchase from Mexico, which had achieved independence from Spain in 1821. The Mexican government granted citizenship to Americans settling in the country, and Stephen Austin led 300 families to do so in 1825. Political instability and constant changes in the Mexican government complicated the negotiations, and Jackson refused his envoy Anthony Butler's suggestion of offering bribes to Mexican officials. Despairing over the prospects of acquiring Texas through diplomacy, Jackson turned to his protégé Sam Houston, who had previously spoken of launching an expedition to Texas to conquer it for the United States. In the summer of 1832, Jackson met Houston at the Hermitage and gave him funds to travel to Texas on the pretext of investigating Native American affairs, while reporting back on the sentiments of the settlers in Texas towards the Mexican government. By the early 1830s, the Mexicans were seeking to stop the flow of American immigrants into Texas and expressly banned the settlers from bringing slaves. In late 1835, some Texans, comprising both American-born and Mexican-born citizens, rose in revolt, captured San Antonio, and forced the Mexican troops to move back south of the Rio Grande. In response, Mexican President Antonio López de Santa Anna vowed vengeance and threatened to retake Texas and march all the way to Washington. By early 1836, the Mexicans had retaken San Antonio after defeating the Texans at the Battle of the Alamo. While Jackson maintained official neutrality towards Mexico, he did nothing to prevent Americans from joining the Texan rebels. Houston was now in command of rebel forces and hoped to lure the Mexicans into disputed territory, allowing General Edmund Gaines to intervene with his American army. Houston's men were less inclined to retreat, and instead the Texans defeated Santa Anna alone at the Battle of San Jacinto on the 21st of April, 1836. After being taken prisoner, Santa Anna had no choice but to recognize Texan independence. While Houston wrote to Jackson, inviting the United States to annex Texas, Jackson was not prepared to do so during a presidential election year, and only recognized the independence of the Republic of Texas on the 3rd of March, 1837, the final day of his presidency. Jackson was succeeded as president by Martin Van Buren, who vowed to continue his predecessor's policies. The 70-year-old Jackson returned to the Hermitage in Tennessee. Despite Jackson's successes, the estate was poorly run and in debt, as a result of it being mismanaged by the former president's adopted son, Andrew Jackson Jr. During his retirement, Jackson continued to take an interest in political issues that Van Buren inherited from him, writing to the new president a couple of times a month with advice. After the expiry of the charter of the Bank of the United States, Biddle had the bank reincorporated in Pennsylvania and induced the state banks to restrict credit during the Panic of 1837, which had been set off by Jackson's bursting of the land bubble. In late 1838, Jackson's solution to the Cherokee dispute with Georgia was implemented, as 13,000 Cherokees were removed to Oklahoma by an armed force led by Winfield Scott, 4,000 of whom perished during this most violent episode in the Trail of Tears and the Native American removals of the 1830s that Jackson was the architect of. Elsewhere, Jackson's assertive presidency had won him many enemies who coalesced to form the Whig Party. In the election of 1840, Van Buren was defeated by the Whig candidate General William Henry Harrison, who took a page from Jackson's book by running a campaign on his war record. When Harrison died of pneumonia after just a month in office, his vice president, John Tyler, succeeded to the office, surprising the Whigs by vetoing a new charter for a national bank. In the early 1840s, Jackson exchanged several letters with Sam Houston about the future of Texas. As president of the Texas Republic, Houston informed his mentor that he still hoped to join the United States, but in the event the United States refused to accept Texas as a state, the Texans could expand westwards to the Pacific and cultivate an economic relationship with the British to the north in Canada, and northwestwards where they had a claim to modern-day Oregon and Washington state. Having received the hint that an independent Texas may be prepared to establish close ties with the British, Jackson lobbied Congress for the annexation of Texas. He was also in favor of full recognition of American sovereignty in the Oregon Territory, which was at the time jointly occupied by Britain and the United States. With Texas as the key issue of the 1844 campaign, Henry Clay won the Whig nomination opposing annexation. Van Buren remained the favorite for the Democratic nomination, but when Jackson attacked him for refusing to support annexation, former Congressman and Tennessee Governor James K. Polk emerged as the dark horse candidate and won the subsequent election, promising to annex Texas and Oregon. President Tyler, after accomplishing little in office, decided to introduce a joint resolution of the House and Senate to approve the annexation of Texas. Tyler signed the annexation bill on the 1st of March, 1845, 3 days before the end of his term, and Texas gained statehood on the 29th of December. By then, Andrew Jackson was already dead, having passed away at the Hermitage on the 8th of June, 1845, at the age of 78. Andrew Jackson left behind a legacy as one of the most controversial presidents in American history. A precocious individual, he fought in the American Revolutionary War and became a trained lawyer before he was 20 years of age. His first major role in American life was in the formation of the state of Tennessee, and while he hailed originally from the Carolinas, he is perhaps Tennessee's most famous son in many respects. Jackson's subsequent role in American life was forged through his military career, becoming a hero of the War of 1812 and also playing a major part in the wars against the Creek, Seminole, and other Native American groups in the 1810s. He was robbed of the White House in 1824 through a corrupt bargain between John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay. Thereafter, efforts to win him the 1828 U.S. presidential election led to the formation of the Democratic Party. Having won that election, his 8 years as president were controversial. Scandals like the Petticoat Affair and the clashes in Congress over the National Bank, tariffs, and secession dominated his time in the White House. But in retrospect, his passage of the Indian Removal Act in 1830 and the quasi-genocidal Trail of Tears that followed seem the gravest black spot on Jackson's legacy, along with his failure to engage in any constructive way with the slavery issue. Despite all of this, there is no denying Jackson's importance in the history of the United States in the 19th century. He played a crucial role in southwestern expansion and then, as president, dominated the country's politics for 2 decades, such that many scholars define the second party system which existed between the mid-1820s and the mid-1850s as effectively being a clash between Jacksonians and anti-Jacksonians. He might not have been a particularly good president, but he was an immensely significant one. What do you think of Andrew Jackson? Was he an American hero and champion of states' rights and manifest destiny? Or was he a dangerous populist who engaged in ethnic cleansing while destabilizing the country through his reckless domestic agenda? Please, let us know in the comments section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.